In the previous videos, we already finished our discussion about Meiji Restoration. If we say, Japan is an A student during the Meiji Restoration because it did pretty well in terms of transforming from ancient agricultural society to a modern industrialized one. Okay? Then here, when we look at the post-World War II, the economic prosperity or development in Japan would be even more amazing. So you could say that, if the pre-war Japan was an A student, then post-war it's actually an A plus student. Okay. Now here I'm pulling out this Gapminder figure for Japan, and we also put the US and the UK in the background for us to compare. Okay. And we actually saw this one before, at the beginning of this chapter when we talk about the Meiji Restoration, right? And as you could see here, in late 1930s and early 1940s, Japan's economy was pretty much destroyed because of the World War II. Okay, and we said that this was not surprised that Japan actually initiated the wars or the invasion in many Asian economies because of its ultimate goal of the Meiji Restoration, okay, and its samurai tradition. And so during the World War II, you can see that the income per person, which is measured by GDP per capita, PPP, purchasing power parity, inflation adjusted, decreased by more than half, okay, from above $4,000 PPP dollars to nearly $2,000. Okay, and different from the United States, although the main territory of Japan was not, like invaded by other armies, okay, but it's actually, has been during the war, the major cities in Japan were all bombed by the U.S. Air Forces. Okay, and so a lot of factories, buildings, machinery, equipment were all destroyed. A lot of people actually died, especially males, okay, on the battlefield. But what surprised the whole world is, from the late 1940s to at least the 1980s, we find that this income curve of Japan becomes even steeper compared to the pre-war. In other words, the growth rate was even higher after World War II. So this is so-called the post-war economic miracle. Okay? Now, for this part of our discussion, we're gonna focus upon this historical period. Okay, and after we finish this, then as the third part of our discussion in this chapter, we're going to talk about more recent decades. Okay, now for the post-war economic miracle, we find that there are more data available for us to do the more rigorous economic analysis. Okay, so we would have more interesting findings. All right. The first thing is, how fast did post-war Japan grow? Okay, because we said that Japan is an A+ student. Then we really want to know how well it did after World War II. Okay. Now here, this is a figure I took from the book, about Japan, which I listed in our syllabus. Okay, and here the vertical axis is the log GMP, okay, which is a gross national product. And we take log because we can, show the trajectory of income within a smaller scale. So as you can see on the vertical axis, it's from 8 to 13. Okay. The purpose of doing this is to kind of compress these volatiles or fluctuations, okay, and so that we can better focus upon the long-term trend of its economic development. Okay, and again, you can see here from 1825 all the way to 1930s. There's a long-term development, okay, in more than 100 years. And we said that, this process has been speed up after the major restoration, okay. And but after the end of the World War II, the economic recovery in Japan went extremely well. Okay, so here you see two kind of the lines we put in the graph to help us better understand this. The first one is this horizontal line, which is a pre-war GMP level. Okay, so again, it tells us, like from this horizontal line to the solid curve, tells us, how much more the Japanese economy grew or produced, okay, in the decades after the World War II. And another dashed line here, upward sloping one, it shows that, if Japan after the World War II continued the same upward trend, the pre-war trend, then how fast it should grow. Okay, again, as you can see, the actual trajectory is much more steeper than this pre-war trend. Okay, pre-World War II trend. In other words, even compared with itself before the World War II, the Japan actually did pretty well during the post-war period. Okay. Now here, a technical question I want to leave for you guys to figure out and for all of us to discuss later during our class meeting is, what is a GMP, okay? And how does it differ from GDP, and why we want to use GMP here? Okay, when we look at the historical period or the growth of Japanese economy. Okay, three questions. I believe that your professor should mention GMP in your intro class or intermediate macro. Okay, if not, again, just simply Google it. I believe the concept should be very straightforward. Okay, and you can also do some research about the difference between GDP and GMP. Okay, GDP we all know it's a gross domestic product, right? And I believe that everybody in this class should have a solid understanding of it. Okay. Now, today we know that GDP is quite popular. Okay, whenever people talk about the size of the economy, the growth of the economy, or the income level, we use GDP or GDP per capita a lot. Okay, you barely hear people talking about GMP. Okay, unless you're talking to a professional economist. Okay, so here we want to know why we on this chart we did not use GDP. Instead, we actually use GMP to show this post-war growth of Japanese economy. Okay, again, do some research and probably go back and look at your notes, your textbook for the intro or intermediate macro economics. Okay. All right. Some of you probably still want to know the discrepancies between these two. Okay, so because on the previous chart we already look at two different measures, right? The first one is the PPP dollars. The second one is the GNP, right? So we would wonder, what is really the difference between GDP and GNP? In other words, if we would, use GDP to show the for the same period, how fast Japan's economy grow, would that make a different figure? Would we draw a different conclusion? Okay. Now, fortunately, as I already mentioned, the data is actually available to us, okay, or more available compared to the that during the major restoration. So here, I'm actually pulling out a FRED chart. FRED means Federal Reserve Economic Database, okay, or economic data. And the specific variable I'm graphing here is the ratio of GNP to GDP. Once again, here to have a good understanding of the chart, you still need to, understand what the GNP is in the first place. Okay. And so this ratio, if it equals 1, that means GDP and GNP are exactly the same. Okay. If the ratio is greater than 1, the GNP is greater. Otherwise, the GDP is greater. Okay, when the ratio is less than 1. And I also put so this blue solid line shows the Japan's ratio. Okay, I also put the U.S. ratio in the background, as the red dashed line, so that we can make a comparison. Okay. Again, during our class meeting, we can discuss this chart with more details. Okay. For example, which one is greater for Japan during what period? Okay, and why? Okay, what was really going on in Japan or in the world that leads to different trends, different fluctuations in different historical periods. Okay, so we're gonna again spend more time discussing these details later in class. Okay. All right, so here again we get more data about Japan's post-war growth rate. So here we look at the 5-year average real GNP growth rate. Okay, now 5-year average is a statistical methods we often used when we look at the mid to long-term economic growth. Okay, because in the short term, again, there might be a lot of fluctuations caused by some, abnormal events like 9/11 terrorist attack, like pandemic last year and this year as well, right? So if we take a 5-year average, we can even out at least partially, the influence of these abnormal events. Okay. Now, as you can see, that from 1953, that's the beginning of the data point, to even 1970s, right? You can find that the economic growth rate in Japan was extremely high. Okay, from the 7.0 to 11.2%. Okay, so in 1960s and 70s, and it's even a double-digit growth. That's very impressive. Okay, once again from the same book, I took this figure showing the growth rate of Japan and the United States. Okay, as you can see, from the mid to late 1950s all the way to the early 1970s, the Japanese economic growth rate was higher than that in the United States. Okay, and all right, so here we already talked about how fast it grow, and in the next video we're gonna discuss how could it grow this fast. Okay, especially for the rest of the world to copy